Welcome back, everyone. Today we have a truly disturbing case to look at, one that shocked Australia and really the entire world.
The story of Katherine Knight.
Yeah, and we really want to be sensitive to the victim's family.
Absolutely.
And anyone affected by the events we're going to discuss today. We're going to walk through everything as it happened, drawing from the sources our listener sent in, and hopefully paint a clear picture of just how disturbing this case truly is.
So Katherine Knight. She was born on October 24th, 1955, in Tenterfield, New South Wales, just minutes after her twin sister, Joy. And even her birth, it was surrounded by unusual circumstances.
Oh, really? How so?
Her mother, Barbara, had left her husband to be with Ken Knight,
Okay.
described as well a severe alcoholic who worked at the local abattoir, a slaughterhouse.
Right. And just for our listeners who might not be familiar, an abattoir is basically an industrial facility for slaughtering animals.
Exactly.
For meat production.
Yes.
Okay. So that's already, the beginning there is pretty interesting. So what happened next?
So the family, they ended up moving to another small town called Aberdeen. And Ken Knight, well, he was known to be extremely abusive toward Barbara, both physically and sexually.
Whoa.
And this abuse, it happened multiple times a day. And even worse, Katherine and her siblings, they witnessed it.
Oh, that's awful.
It is. And Barbara, she would often confide in young Katherine and her sister about the abuse she suffered.
Wow. That's a huge burden to place on young children. Given the long-term effects of childhood trauma, that early exposure to violence, it could have profoundly shaped Katherine's development, affecting her relationships and the way she coped with stress later in life.
Absolutely. Katherine's childhood, it was deeply scarred by this domestic violence. And there are also allegations from various sources that she was a victim of sexual abuse by other family members as well.
It seems like she was surrounded by violence and abuse from a very young age.
Yes, it does. And even as a child, Katherine was known to have a really bad temper and was often described as a bully, even getting into a physical altercation with her twin sister Joy over a bicycle.
Oh, wow. So it seems like the aggression was already present quite early on.
It does, yeah. She left school at 15 with limited literacy skills.
Yeah.
But she had this aspiration. She wanted to work at the abattoir, just like her family.
So she wanted to follow in her father's footsteps, so to speak, even despite the violence she had witnessed there.
It seems that way, yes.
Oh.
And by 16, she achieved that goal. She started working in the all room of the abattoir.
The all room.
Yes. It's not clear exactly what this refers to, but it might be an old term or maybe just a local term used within the abattoir.
Okay.
But later on, she became a boner.
A boner.
Yes. That means she was responsible for removing bones from carcasses. It was a physically demanding job where she processed around 600 carcasses every day.
Wow, that's a lot. 600 carcasses a day. I mean, it's really hard to imagine the kind of psychological impact that kind of work could have on a person, being surrounded by death and the process of butchering animals.
Absolutely.
Day in and day out.
It's definitely something to consider, especially in light of her later actions.
Okay.
So moving on to Katherine's adult life.
Okay.
Her relationships were, well, sadly, they were often marked by violence. She married young to a man named David Kellett.
Okay.
And early on, there were incidents of violence. But Katherine, she convinced David not to press charges.
Really? She convinced him not to report her to the police? That's already a sign of a very troubled relationship.
Yes, it is. They had a daughter together, Melissa Ram.
Okay.
But eventually, David, he left Katherine for another woman and moved to Queensland.
Quite a distance.
It is. And Katherine's reaction to the separation was, well, it was extreme. She stole an axe and made threats against David.
Oh my gosh. That escalated quickly. An axe.
Yes. And then, possibly the most disturbing event happened during this time. Katherine actually tried to harm their infant daughter.
Oh no. What did she do?
She placed their 2-month-old daughter's pram on train tracks.
What? She tried to put her own baby in front of a train?
Yes. Thankfully, a local man known as Old Ted, he intervened and saved the little girl just moments before the train arrived.
That's terrifying. It's almost unbelievable that someone could do that to their own child. So what happened after this incident? Surely there were consequences for such a horrifying act.
Well, yes, Katherine was admitted to a mental health facility, but she discharged herself the very next day.
She just left.
Yes. And what's truly shocking is, despite this clear act of attempted infanticide, There were no attempted murder charges and no intervention from Child Protective Services, at least not according to any of the sources we have.
Wow. That's really disturbing. The lack of action from authorities is just, it's unbelievable.
It is. And unfortunately, the violence didn't stop there. Katherine went on to attack a coworker at the abattoir, slashing her face with a knife, and then force her on a road trip to Queensland.
Oh my gosh. It seems like she was spiraling further and further into violence. What was the purpose of this road trip?
It seems she was looking for David and intended to stab him.
So she kidnapped her coworker to help her find her ex-husband and potentially harm him.
Yes. The coworker managed to escape at a service station, thankfully. But then Katherine took things even further.
What happened?
She held a mechanic hostage at knife point.
This is insane.
And according to the sources we have, when the police arrived to handle the situation, they only had brooms to try to disarm her.
Brooms against a woman wielding a knife?
Yes. It's a rather baffling detail.
It really is. So what happened to Katherine after that?
She was sent to Morisset Psychological Hospital, where she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. But just like before, she checked herself out the next day. And even more disturbingly, she told nurses about her plans to kill David, his mother, and the mechanic she had threatened.
Borderline personality disorder. Could you explain what that means for our listeners who might not be familiar with the term?
Of course. Borderline personality disorder, or BPD, is a mental health condition that causes extreme instability in moods, relationships, self-image, and behavior. People with BPD often have intense and unstable relationships. They may have trouble controlling their emotions and may engage in impulsive and reckless behavior. So you can see how some of those characteristics might be relevant in Katherine's case.
Absolutely. She certainly displayed instability in her relationships and a tendency towards impulsive, violent behavior.
Right, and despite her threats and the clear danger she posed, in a strange turn of events, when David heard about what was happening, he actually felt guilty.
Guilty?
Yes. He ended his new relationship and went back to Aberdeen with his mother to take care of Katherine.
Wow, that's unexpected.
It is. They even tried to start their relationship over in Brisbane, and they had another child in 1983.
So for a moment there, it seemed like maybe things were looking up for Katherine.
Well, not exactly. In 1984, she left David again and returned to Aberdeen with their 2 children. She went back to work at the slaughterhouse.
So the cycle of violence and reconciliation continued. It seems like even though David tried to help, the underlying issues were never truly addressed.
Exactly. And that brings us to Katherine's second marriage, to a man named David Saunders.
Okay, so what can you tell us about this relationship?
Well, soon after returning to Aberdeen, Katherine met David Saunders. He was a coal miner and a former speedway driver.
Okay.
They moved in together in 1987.
And how did this relationship play out?
Sadly, it followed a similar pattern. The honeymoon phase was very short-lived, only a couple of months according to the sources. Katherine became convinced that David was having an affair because he kept an apartment in Scone. This led to constant fights and violent outbursts. Katherine would throw him out, then beg him to come back.
That cycle again. It's heartbreaking to see this pattern repeating itself. So was there physical violence in this relationship as well?
Yes. Katherine would attack David, beating him with her fists and boots.
It seems like the violence was escalating with each relationship. Did it go beyond physical assaults?
It did. In one particularly cruel incident, David tried to leave Katherine, and in retaliation, she slit the throat of his 8-week-old dingo puppy right in front of him.
Oh my God, that's monstrous. To kill a defenseless animal like that, it seems like she was becoming increasingly desensitized to violence and cruelty.
It does. And the abuse didn't stop there. She later attacked David with a frying pan, knocking him unconscious.
Again with the head injuries, this level of violence is just horrifying.
It is. And despite these attacks, they stayed together. They even had a daughter in 1988.
Another child brought into this volatile and dangerous environment.
Yes. And tragically, the violence continued. Katherine stabbed David in the face with an iron and then tried to crush his skull.
This is just, it's almost too much to comprehend. The level of brutality is just staggering.
I agree. She also stabbed him in the stomach with scissors. After these attacks, David finally left. He went into hiding in another town, and then Katherine took out an apprehended violence order against him.
A restraining order. After everything she had done to him, it seems like she was trying to control him even as he tried to escape the abuse.
It does, yes.
And despite the violence, the restraining order, they remarried.
Yes, they did.
It's just baffling. Why would they go back to each other after all that?
It's hard to understand. But that's what happened. And then we come to John Chillingworth.
Another relationship. It seems like Katherine moved from one tumultuous relationship to the next.
That's right. She met John Chillingworth in 1991 at a local hotel.
Okay.
Now, this relationship is interesting because there are fewer reports of physical violence from Katherine towards John. Perhaps because he was a larger man.
That's one theory, yes. But the relationship was still toxic. They were constantly breaking up and getting back together.
So the emotional turmoil was still very present, even if the physical violence was less pronounced.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
They had a son together, Eric, in March of 1991.
Okay.
John claimed that Katherine beat him up, but Katherine's daughter claimed that he was often violent towards her and her mother.
So conflicting accounts of who was the abuser in this relationship.
Yes. And during this time, Katherine also had an affair with a man named John Price. Eventually, she kicked John Chillingworth out of the house. Another John. It seems like she had a pattern of being drawn to men named John.
It does, yes. So Katherine's relationship with John Price started in October of 1993. They were both 38 years old.
Okay.
Price already had 3 children from a previous marriage, whom he adored. By 1995, Katherine had moved into Price's home.
So their relationship progressed quite quickly?
It did, yes.
And how was the dynamic between them?
It was volatile. A lot of arguing. Katherine would often move back and forth between John's house and her own place, which was decorated, rather unusually, with old farm equipment and taxidermied animals.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty unique decorating style.
It is, yes. And Katherine, she was known to be jealous and vindictive. She even got John fired from his job at the mine by falsely accusing him of stealing a first aid kit.
Wow. That's a pretty extreme reaction, just to get him fired from his job. It seems like she was really trying to exert control over him.
Yes, it does seem that way.
Were there signs of physical violence in this relationship as well?
Unfortunately, yes. Co-workers of John Price started noticing cuts and bruises on him. And then, the weekend before his death, Katherine stabbed him in the chest while his children were hiding in the house.
Oh my God. That's terrifying.
It is. Just imagine the fear those children must have felt witnessing that level of violence.
I can't even imagine. This was a clear escalation. She was becoming increasingly dangerous.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And realizing the danger he was in, John Price went to the Scone Magistrates Court and took out a restraining order against Katherine on February 29, 2000.
So he was finally taking steps to protect himself.
He was.
Did this stop Katherine?
His coworkers begged him not to go home, fearing for his safety.
They must have known how volatile she was.
Yes, they did. But John, he was worried about his children. He didn't know that Katherine had already sent them to stay with a relative.
Oh no. So he walked right back into a dangerous situation, unaware that his children were already safe.
Sadly, yes. On March 1st, 2000, John returned home after visiting his neighbors and went to bed around 11 p.m. Katherine arrived at the house sometime later.
Okay.
And according to the evidence, they had sex. Then John got out of bed to use the bathroom and came back to bed. It was then that Katherine attacked him.
While he was in bed.
Yes. The mattress was later found soaked with blood.
It sounds like a scene out of a horror movie.
It's truly horrifying. John tried to escape, but he was too weak to make it out of the house. He left a trail of blood as he stumbled down the hallway, desperately trying to get away from Katherine.
She was relentless.
Yes. She stabbed him repeatedly, at least 37 times, in the back and sides.
37 times. This was a frenzied attack.
It was. John made it to the front door, but he just didn't have the strength to open it. Katherine dragged him back inside, and he died in the hallway, right behind the front door.
It's just unimaginable. The pain, the terror he must have felt in those final moments.
It's truly heartbreaking. But as horrific as John's murder was, what Katherine did next is even more disturbing.
What could be more disturbing than that?
Well, she dragged John's body into the living room, and using the skills she had learned at the abattoir, she skinned him.
Skinned him like an animal.
Yes. She removed his skin in one piece, including the skin from his head, face, and genitals.
Oh my God, this is beyond comprehension.
She then hung his skin on a meat hook in the archway between the hallway and the living room.
This is just pure evil. What kind of person could do something like that?
Yeah, it's hard to fathom. But the horror doesn't end there. Katherine then decapitated John and took his head into the kitchen. She put it in a pot on the stove and cooked it with vegetables. Potatoes and cabbage, to be specific.
She cooked his head like a piece of meat.
Yes, and she didn't stop there. She also cut off pieces of his buttocks, baked them in the oven with vegetables, and placed them on plates on the dining room table. She even put folded notes with the names of his children on the plates, as if she was preparing a meal for them.
This is beyond depraved.
It is. It's a level of cruelty that's hard to even grasp.
It is. What happened next?
Well, after all of that, Katherine took a shower, got dressed, and went to an ATM. She withdrew $1,000 from John's bank account in 2 separate transactions.
It's just chilling how she could go about these everyday tasks after committing such horrific acts.
It is. She then went back to the house, had a cigarette and something to eat, and went to bed.
So she just carried on as if nothing had happened.
It seems that way, yes. The next morning, around 6, a neighbor noticed that John's work truck was still at home.
Which was unusual because he always left early for work.
Exactly. The neighbor, along with a friend, went to check on John and saw blood on the front door. They called the police.
It must have been a horrifying sight for those who discovered the crime scene.
It was. The police arrived around 8:10 a.m. and had to force their way into the house through the back door. One of the first officers to enter, Officer Matthews, saw what he thought was a blanket hanging in the hallway.
Which turned out to be John's skin.
Yes. They then found John's headless body in the living room. His head was in a pot on the stove in the kitchen.
And the plates with the cooked human flesh.
Yes, those were on the dining table. Katherine was found in the bedroom. She was unconscious. Apparently, she had overdosed on pills and was snoring loudly.
So she tried to take her own life after committing these atrocities.
It appears that way. The crime scene was so horrific that many of the officers, even seasoned veterans, were traumatized by it.
It's understandable. This wasn't just a murder. It was something far more sinister and depraved.
Absolutely. One of the fingerprint technicians was so disturbed that he resigned the next day.
So what happened to Katherine?
She was charged with murder at a bedside hearing while she was still in the hospital.
Okay.
At first, she claimed to have no memory of what happened. But later, in October of 2001, she pleaded guilty to murder.
Did they determine a motive for these horrific acts?
3 psychiatrists evaluated Katherine and diagnosed her with a personality disorder. However, they all agreed that she was sane at the time of the murder.
So she understood what she was doing. It wasn't a crime of passion or a psychotic break. This was a calculated act of brutality.
That seems to be the consensus, yes. The judge in the case was particularly struck by the level of expertise Katherine displayed in skinning John's body.
Drawing on her experience at the abattoir.
Exactly. On November 8, 2001, Judge Barry O'Keefe sentenced Katherine Mary Knight to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Wow. The first Australian woman to receive such a sentence.
Yes. The judge ordered that her files be marked never to be released, meaning she would never be eligible for parole. He considered her too dangerous to ever be released back into society. He believed that she took pleasure in her horrific acts, calling it a ritual of death and defilement.
That's a chilling assessment. He believed that she derived satisfaction from the torture and mutilation she inflicted.
Yes. And in 2006, an appeal against her sentence was unsuccessful.
So she remains in prison to this day. This case truly shocked Australia and the world.
It did. The media dubbed her the female Hannibal Lecter, and the house where these gruesome acts took place was eventually renovated.
Trying to erase the stain of that horrific night.
Yes. Former Detective Luke Taylor commented on how disturbing this case was, particularly because of the contrast between Katherine's seemingly normal outward appearance and the extreme violence of her actions.
It's a stark reminder that evil can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary people.
Absolutely. And there's another detail that's both disturbing and confusing. John Chillingworth, Katherine's former partner, the one she had a son with, he visited her in prison in 2020.
What? After everything she'd done?
Yes. He said she seemed calmer and was engaging in activities like pottery and painting. Other inmates even called her grandma.
That's just bizarre. How could anyone, let alone someone who had been in a relationship with her, see her as a harmless grandmother figure after all of this?
It's hard to understand. However, despite these reports, authorities maintain that Katherine Knight will never be released from prison.
It seems like they recognize the true danger she poses, regardless of any superficial changes in her behavior.
Yes. It's crucial to acknowledge the role of domestic violence in this tragedy. The abuse that Katherine both experienced and inflicted was a constant thread throughout her life.
It's a tragic cycle, and a stark reminder that abuse in any form is never acceptable. We need to support victims of domestic violence and break this cycle of pain.
I agree. And this case also raises questions about the potential desensitizing effects of working in environments like slaughterhouses.
Where violence and death are part of the daily routine.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember the trauma experienced by the police officers who had to deal with this horrific crime scene. Many of them suffered from PTSD and needed counseling to cope with what they'd witnessed.
This case is truly a testament to the darkest depths of human cruelty. We've walked through the timeline of Katherine Knight's life and the horrific events of March 2000. We've tried to present the facts with the gravity and respect this case deserves. The impact on John Price, his family, and the entire community is immeasurable.
Absolutely. And it compels us to consider the devastating consequences of domestic violence and the importance of addressing it in our society.
We encourage everyone listening to reflect on this case and to learn more about domestic abuse and the long-term effects of trauma. And if you have any thoughts on this deeply disturbing case, please share them with us in the comments below.
Thank you for listening.